The crimson sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Creek as Katherine Anderson stumbled forward, her once pristine blue dress now torn and smeared with dirt. Blood trickled from her split lip as the jeering crowd circled her like vultures, their cruel laughter echoing off the wooden storefronts of the small Wyoming town. "Thief!" shouted the butcher, his meaty face contorted with rage. "We don't take kindly to your kind here." It was 1878, and the West was still wild, unforgiving to those who didn't fit the rigid expectations of frontier society. Katherine's crime had been simple. She'd taken a job at the Silver Dollar Saloon to survive after her father's death left her penniless. In the eyes of Silver Creek's self-appointed moral guardians, that made her little better than a harlot. "I've done nothing wrong," Katherine protested, her voice barely audible as she raised her arms to shield herself from the next blow. The butcher's wife, a severe woman with pinched features, stepped forward and slapped her hard across the face. "Jezebel," the woman spat. Parading around in that dress, tempting honest men, Katherine staggered backward, tears streaming down her face. She'd only been in town 3 weeks, trying to make enough money to buy passage east to her aunt in Boston. Now, she wondered if she'd even survive the day. The crowd had grown to nearly 20 people, most content to watch while a few took active part in her humiliation. No one stepped forward to help her. No one except him. He appeared at the edge of the crowd, tall and imposing on his dappled gray stallion. Dust coated his long brown duster, and the wide brim of his black Stetson cast his face in shadow. Without a word, he dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made several people step back. "This ain't your business, stranger," said the butcher, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. The man, the cowboy, ignored him entirely. Instead, he walked straight to Katherine, who was now on her knees in the dirt. With gentle hands, he removed his hat and placed it over her head, shielding her from both the harsh sun and the hateful stares. "Can you stand, miss?" he asked quietly. Katherine nodded weakly, and he helped her to her feet, one strong arm supporting her waist. She looked up at him then, seeing his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. "My name's Blake Sutton," he told her, his voice for her ears alone. "And I believe it's time we left this sorry excuse for a town." The butcher stepped forward again, emboldened by whiskey and the support of the crowd. "She ain't going nowhere. She stole from my shop." Blake's hand moved to rest on the gun at his hip, though he didn't draw it. "Did you see her take anything?" "Well, no. But then I suggest you and these fine folks return to your business before someone gets hurt." His tone made it clear exactly who he thought that someone might be. The crowd's mood shifted, uncertainty replacing righteous anger. Blake used the moment to guide Katherine toward his horse. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered, wincing at the pain in her ribs. He helped her into the saddle, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her as he took the reins, and Katherine felt a strange sense of safety despite the circumstances. "Hold on," he murmured, and then they were moving, the horse's powerful strides carrying them away from the town and the hatred it had shown her. Katherine clutched the saddle horn, Blake's hat still perched on her head, its brim flapping in the wind. She didn't know who this man was or where he was taking her, but at that moment, anything seemed better than what she was leaving behind. They rode for nearly an hour, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. Katherine's body ached from the beating, and she found herself leaning back against Blake's solid chest. If he minded, he didn't say so. Eventually, they crested a rise and a small cabin came into view, nestled in a clearing beside a stream. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a corral to one side held several horses. "My place," Blake explained as they approached. "Not much, but it's peaceful." He helped her dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way. Catherine's fingers clutched at his sleeve. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him with confusion in her honey-brown eyes. "Why did you help me?" Blake's weathered face softened slightly. "Because no one else would." He took his hat back gently from her head and settled it on his own. "Come on inside. Let's tend to those cuts." The cabin was simple but clean, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of something savory smelling hanging over the low flames. A narrow doorway presumably led to a bedroom. "Sit," Blake said, gesturing to a wooden chair at the table. He filled a basin with water from a bucket and gathered clean cloths from a shelf. Katherine sank into the chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice cracking. "I've been working at the saloon serving drinks. I needed the money." "I know," Blake replied, kneeling in front of her with the basin. Silver Creek's a narrow-minded place, full of people who'd rather judge than understand. He dipped a cloth in the water and carefully began cleaning the dirt from her face. Katherine winced as the cloth touched her split lip. "Sorry," he murmured. "That butcher's wife has a heavy hand." "You saw that," Blake nodded, his expression darkening. "I came into town for supplies, heard the commotion and saw what was happening." He wrung out the cloth and dipped it again. "Couldn't just ride past." Katherine studied him as he worked. His hands were calloused from hard work, but his touch was gentle. A thin scar ran along his jawline and his dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar. "What do you do out here, Mr. Sutton?" she asked. "Blake," he corrected. "I raise horses, break them for the ranches around these parts." He finished cleaning her face and stood. "And I keep to myself, mostly." He moved to the fireplace and stirred the pot hanging there. Hungry, Katherine realized she was famished. She hadn't eaten since early morning before her shift at the saloon. "Yes, thank you." Blake ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls and set one before her, along with a hunk of bread. "It's not fancy, but it's filling." They ate in companionable silence. The stew was surprisingly good beef, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth. Katherine ate every bite, then sat back, feeling more human than she had in hours. "What will you do now?" Blake asked, collecting their empty bowls. Katherine's hands twisted in her lap. "I don't know. I can't go back to Silver Creek." "No," he agreed. "That wouldn't be wise." "I was saving for passage to Boston. My father's sister lives there." Katherine touched her lip gingerly. "But all my things are still at the boarding house. And my savings." Blake considered this as he washed the bowls in the basin. "I can go back tomorrow, get your things." "You do that?" Katherine looked at him in surprise. He shrugged. "They won't bother me." "Why are you being so kind to a stranger?" Blake dried his hands on a towel and leaned against the rough-hewn table. "Maybe I know what it's like to be judged unfairly." His eyes met hers. "You can stay here until you figure things out. I've got a spare bunk in the lean-to where I keep my tack." Katherine felt tears well up in her eyes again, this time from gratitude. "Thank you, Blake." He nodded once, almost awkwardly, then said, "You should rest. You've had a hard day." She couldn't argue with that. Blake showed her to the lean-to, a small but clean space with a narrow cot, a shelf, and a small window. He left her with a lamp, a blanket, and a clean shirt of his to sleep in. "I'll be in the cabin if you need anything," he said before ducking out the door. Left alone, Katherine carefully removed her torn dress, wincing at the bruises blossoming on her arms and ribs. She pulled on Blake's shirt, which hung to her knees, and climbed onto the cot. Despite the day's trauma, she felt strangely safe. As she drifted toward sleep, she wondered about the quiet cowboy who had come to her rescue when no one else would. Morning came with the sound of a rooster crowing and the smell of coffee. Katherine awoke disoriented, her body stiff and aching. It took a moment to remember where she was and why. She sat up gingerly, cataloging her injuries: bruised ribs, a cut lip, various scrapes and bruises on her arms and legs. Painful, but nothing that wouldn't heal. She found a bucket of clean water outside the lean-to door and used it to wash as best she could. Her dress was a lost cause, torn and stained beyond repair. She had no choice but to continue wearing Blake's shirt, though she tied her petticoat around her waist to make it more modest. When she entered the cabin, Blake was at the stove, frying bacon. He glanced over his shoulder at her entrance, his eyes widening slightly at her appearance before he quickly looked back to his cooking. "Morning," he said gruffly. "Sleep all right?" "Yes, thank you." Katherine hovered uncertainly near the door. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Coffee's ready if you want to pour it." He nodded toward a pot on the stove. Katherine found 2 mugs on a shelf and filled them, setting one near Blake. She sipped her own, grateful for the bitter warmth that helped clear her head. "I'll head into town after breakfast," Blake said, sliding bacon onto 2 plates and adding slices of bread. "Make a list of what you need from the boarding house." Katherine accepted the plate he offered. "I don't have much, just a carpet bag with some clothes and personal items. And there's $23 hidden in the lining." She looked down. "Everything I have in the world." Blake sat across from her. "Don't worry about that now. Eat." They ate in silence. Katherine found herself studying Blake when he wasn't looking. In the morning light, she could see that his eyes weren't simply gray, they had flecks of blue in them. A few days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw, and there was a small nick on his chin that looked like it came from shaving. He was handsome in a rugged way, though his expression remained guarded. After breakfast, Katherine wrote down the location of the boarding house and a description of her belongings. Blake tucked the paper into his shirt pocket. "I'll be back by mid-afternoon," he said, settling his hat on his head. "Make yourself at home. There's more stew in the pot if you get hungry." "Please be careful," Katherine said impulsively. They were very angry yesterday. Something flickered in Blake's eyes, surprise, perhaps. "Don't worry about me, Miss Anderson. I can handle Silver Creek." After he'd ridden away, Katherine explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was simple but well built, with tight seams against the winter cold. Besides the main room, there was a small bedroom with a sturdy bed and a chest for clothes. A few books sat on a shelf, mostly practical guides to horsemanship and animal husbandry, but also a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans. Outside, she discovered a vegetable garden behind the cabin, surprisingly well tended. Carrots, potatoes, beans, and corn grew in neat rows. A chicken coop housed a half-dozen hens, which explained the fresh eggs at breakfast. Katherine collected eggs, weeded the garden, and swept the cabin floor. The activity helped keep her mind off worries about Blake's reception in town. By mid-afternoon, she had prepared a fresh pot of coffee and was sitting on the cabin's small porch, mending a tear in one of Blake's shirts she'd found in a basket. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Blake approached on his gray stallion, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking chestnut mare. Her carpet bag was tied behind his saddle. Katherine set aside her mending and stood as he dismounted. "You made it back safely." Blake nodded, untying her bag. "No trouble. Most folks were busy with their own concerns." He handed her the carpet bag. "Everything should be there, including your savings." "Thank you." She clutched the bag to her chest. "I can't tell you what this means to me." Blake's eyes softened slightly. "No need." He nodded toward the chestnut mare. Brought you something else. This is Penny. Thought you might like having your own horse while you're here. Katherine stared at him in surprise. For me, but she's gentle. Good for someone who doesn't ride much. He shrugged as if it were nothing. And I can't always be taking you places if you need to go somewhere. That's very thoughtful, Katherine said, stepping forward to stroke the mare's soft nose. The horse whickered softly. Hello, Penny. Blake watched them for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he cleared his throat. I need to see to the other horses. There's a dress in your bag that looks wearable if you want to change. Inside, Katherine unpacked her meager belongings. True to Blake's word, her money was still hidden in the lining of the bag. Among her clothes, she found her blue Sunday dress, the only one that hadn't been damaged in yesterday's attack. She changed gratefully, feeling more like herself in her own clothes. When Blake returned from the corral, he paused in the doorway, his eyes taking in her transformation. You look better, he said simply. I feel better, she replied. Thank you for retrieving my things. Did anyone ask questions? The landlady wondered why I was collecting a lady's belongings. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I told her we were married and you were waiting at our homestead. Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. Oh, seemed the simplest explanation, Blake said, moving to wash his hands in the basin. I heard some talk in town about yesterday. What kind of talk? Katherine asked warily. Some folks are ashamed of what happened, others. He shrugged. Others still think you got what you deserved for working at the saloon, Katherine sighed. It was just a job. I served drinks and cleared tables, nothing more. You don't need to explain yourself to me, Blake said, drying his hands. What a woman does to survive is her business. Something in his tone made Katherine look at him more closely. You sound like you speak from experience. Blake was silent for a long moment. Then he said, My mother was a saloon girl in Cheyenne. Had me when she was 18, raised me on her own until she died of consumption when I was 12. His voice was matter of fact, but Katherine sensed the old pain beneath the words. I'm sorry, she said softly. That must have been hard. It was a long time ago. Blake moved to the stove. Are you hungry? I brought some fresh bread from town. Katherine recognized the change of subject for what it was. Yes, thank you. Can I help with dinner? They worked together to prepare a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and bread. Katherine found herself relaxing in Blake's company. He wasn't much for conversation, but there was something comforting about his quiet presence. After dinner, they sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. In the distance, a coyote called, its mournful howl echoing across the valley. It's beautiful here, Katherine said, breaking the comfortable silence. Blake nodded. That's why I chose it. Far enough from town to avoid trouble, close enough to do business when needed. How long have you lived here? 5 years. Built the cabin myself. He glanced at her. What about you? What brought you to Wyoming? Katherine sighed. My father. He heard there was good farmland for the taking. We came from Pennsylvania last year, but the winter was harsh and he took sick. She swallowed hard. He died in February. The bank took our claim for debts and I had nowhere else to go. So you ended up in Silver Creek. Yes. The saloon job was the only work I could find. Women don't have many options out here. She looked down at her hands. I'm 20 years old and sometimes I feel like I've lived several lifetimes already. Blake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Life's not easy in the West, especially for those on their own. No, Katherine agreed. It's not. They fell silent again, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I should turn in, Katherine said eventually. It's been a long day. I cleared a space in the bedroom for your things, Blake said. You take the bed, I'll sleep out here. Oh, I couldn't, I insist, he interrupted. You're still healing. You need proper rest. Katherine wanted to argue but could see from his expression that it would be useless. Thank you, Blake, for everything. He nodded once, that same almost awkward acknowledgement she was coming to recognize. Good night, Katherine. Good night. In the bedroom, Katherine changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilt on Blake's bed. It smelled faintly of pine and leather like him. She fell asleep, wondering how long this strange arrangement would last, and what would happen when it was time for her to move on. The next week passed in a rhythm that quickly became familiar. Blake rose at dawn to tend to the horses, while Katherine gathered eggs and prepared breakfast. They worked separately through the morning, Blake training horses in the corral, Katherine tending the garden or helping with household chores. They took lunch together, often sitting on the porch if the weather was fair. In the afternoons, Blake taught Katherine to ride Penny properly. She'd ridden before, but never with any formal instruction. Under his patient guidance, she grew more confident in the saddle. "You're a natural," Blake told her on the 5th day, as they rode side by side along the stream that bordered his property. "Penny likes you." Katherine patted the mare's neck affectionately. "I like her too. I've never had a horse of my own before." "She's not exactly yours," Blake said, though without any edge to his voice. "I know," Katherine looked over at him, "but it's nice to pretend just for a while." Something in Blake's expression shifted. "Yes," he said quietly, "I suppose it is." That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Katherine brought up the subject they'd both been avoiding. "I should think about moving on soon," she said, watching Blake's face carefully. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Blake's hand stilled where he'd been cleaning his revolver. "You're not imposing. Still, I can't stay here forever." She twisted a loose thread on her sleeve. "I should continue with my plan to go to Boston." Blake was silent for a long moment, reassembling his gun with practiced movements. Finally, he asked, "Is that what you want, to go east?" Katherine considered the question. "I don't know anymore. It seemed like the only option before, but now." She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the confusion she felt. "There's no rush to decide," Blake said, holstering his weapon. "Winter's coming. Travel will be difficult soon anyway." "Are you suggesting I stay until spring?" Katherine asked, surprised. Blake met her eyes across the room. "I'm saying you have options, and time to consider them." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Katherine found herself noticing details about Blake she hadn't before: the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, the strength in his forearms as he rolled down his sleeves, the surprising gentleness in his storm-gray eyes. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'll think about it." Blake nodded and stood. "I'm heading to bed. Early start tomorrow. Need to check the western pasture before the snow comes." After he'd gone to his makeshift bed on the floor by the fire, Katherine remained in her chair, thinking about their conversation. She'd come to enjoy her time at Blake's cabin far more than she'd expected. The work was hard but satisfying, the surroundings beautiful, and Blake himself. Katherine pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for the taciturn cowboy. He'd been kind to her, yes, but that didn't mean anything beyond basic human decency. And even if it did, what future could they possibly have? Still, as she finally retired to the bedroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that she wouldn't have to leave just yet. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Blake was already gone when Katherine woke, having left a note saying he'd be back by nightfall. She went about her chores with a strange sense of disappointment. She'd grown used to his presence, the quiet companionship they shared. Around midday, as Katherine was kneading dough for bread, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Thinking Blake had returned early, she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. It wasn't Blake. 3 riders approached the cabin, men she didn't recognize. Something about their manner set her immediately on edge. "Hello there, miss," called the lead rider, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard. "We're looking for Blake Sutton." Catherine's hands gripped the porch railing. "He's not here at the moment. Can I help you with something?" The men exchanged glances. "Maybe you can," said the bearded man, dismounting. "You his wife?" "No," Catherine replied cautiously. "Just a friend." The man's eyebrows rose. "A friend, huh? That's mighty interesting." He looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Sutton owes my boss some money. Thought maybe we'd wait for him to get back." "I'm afraid he won't return until evening," Catherine said, backing toward the door. "I can tell him you called." The man's face hardened. "Now that won't do at all. We'll wait." He gestured to his companions. "Tie up the horses, boys. Looks like we're staying for dinner." Catherine's heart raced as the men dismounted. "Please, I'd rather you wasn't asking permission, miss," the bearded man said, mounting the porch steps. "Now, why don't you be hospitable and offer us some coffee?" "It's mighty cold out here." Trapped, Catherine had no choice but to let them in. She served coffee while trying to keep as much distance as possible between herself and the unwelcome visitors. The bearded man, who introduced himself as Harley, seemed to be the leader. The other two, a thin man with a pockmarked face and a younger man with cold eyes, didn't speak much. "So how'd a pretty thing like you end up way out here with Sutton?" Harley asked, lounging in Blake's chair. "That's a private matter," Catherine replied stiffly. Harley chuckled. "Ain't nothing private about Sutton's business, not anymore, not after what he did." Despite her fear, curiosity got the better of Catherine. "What do you mean? You mean he hasn't told you?" Harley's smile was unpleasant. "About the price on his head." Catherine's blood ran cold. "I don't believe you." "Believe what you want, miss. But Blake Sutton killed a man in Colorado 2 years back, shot him dead in a saloon in Denver." Harley sipped his coffee. "My boss had business with that man. He takes it personal when his associates get killed." "Blake wouldn't," Catherine began, then stopped herself. She realized she knew very little about Blake's past. "Wouldn't he?" Harley leaned forward. "You sure about that? How well do you really know him?" Catherine had no answer. The afternoon stretched endlessly as the men made themselves at home, helping themselves to Blake's whiskey and becoming increasingly loud. Catherine retreated to the kitchen area, keeping busy with her bread making while trying to figure out what to do. If what Harley said was true, Blake was in danger, but she had no way to warn him. And if it wasn't true, if these men were lying, they still posed a threat. Either way, she needed to do something before Blake returned. An idea came to her as she put the bread in the oven. "I need to check on the horses," she announced. "They haven't been fed today." Harley waved a hand dismissively. "Go on then, but don't get any ideas about running off. Joe here's a good shot." He nodded toward the cold-eyed young man who patted the rifle at his side. Catherine nodded, trying to appear appropriately cowed. She put on her shawl and left the cabin, walking slowly and deliberately toward the corral. Once out of direct sight of the cabin windows, she quickened her pace, heading for the lean-to where Blake kept his tack. Inside, she found what she was looking for: Blake's spare revolver, kept in a box beneath his saddle. He'd shown it to her once, explaining that a person should always have a backup weapon in case their primary gun failed. Catherine had never fired a gun before, but she understood the basic principle. She checked that it was loaded, then tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Her next stop was the corral, where she quickly saddled Penny. The mare seemed to sense her urgency and stood quietly as Catherine worked. Catherine led Penny around to the back of the lean-to, out of sight from the cabin. Then, gathering her courage, she mounted and urged the horse into a trot, heading west the direction Blake had gone that morning. She'd ridden perhaps a mile when she heard shouts behind her. Looking back, she saw two riders in pursuit, Harley and the cold-eyed man, Joe. The third man must have stayed at the cabin. Fear gave her speed. She urged Penny into a gallop, leaning low over the mare's neck as they raced across the open grassland toward a stand of pine trees in the distance. If she could reach the trees, perhaps she could lose her pursuers. A shot rang out, the bullet whistling past her ear. Katherine ducked lower, her heart pounding. Penny, startled by the gunfire, redoubled her speed. They reached the trees, Penny weaving skillfully between the trunks. Katherine risked a glance back and saw that their lead had increased. The pursuers were having trouble navigating the dense forest at speed. She pressed on, following a game trail that wound deeper into the woods. After about 20 minutes of hard riding, she could no longer hear pursuit. Katherine slowed Penny to a walk, allowing the mare to catch her breath. Now she faced a new problem, finding Blake in the vast expanse of his western pasture. The sun was beginning its downward arc. She had perhaps 4 hours of daylight left. If she couldn't find Blake before dark, she'd have to spend the night alone in the wilderness. She continued westward, climbing a rise that offered a view of the valley below. In the distance, she could see a herd of horses grazing in a meadow. And there, moving among them on his gray stallion, was Blake. Katherine's relief was so intense it made her dizzy. She urged Penny down the slope, waving her arm to catch Blake's attention. He spotted her and rode to meet her, his expression changing from surprise to concern as he drew closer. "Katherine, what's wrong?" he asked as their horses came alongside each other. "Men at the cabin," she gasped, suddenly realizing how frightened she'd been. "3 of them. They said you killed someone in Denver, that there's a price on your head." Blake's face hardened. "Harley Dobbs." Katherine nodded. "That's what he called himself, heavy-set with a beard." Blake cursed under his breath. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "No, I got away before they could stop me, but they followed. I lost them in the woods, but they'll keep looking." She met his eyes anxiously. "Blake, is it true, what they said?" He held her gaze for a long moment, then sighed. "Yes and no. I did kill a man in Denver, but it was self-defense. He drew on me first in front of 20 witnesses." He ran a hand through his hair. "The law cleared me, but his brother Harley and Joe's boss didn't accept that verdict. He's been looking for me ever since." "So there is a price on your head." "An unofficial one, yes." Blake looked grim. "I'm sorry you got caught up in this, Katherine. I should have told you." "Yes, you should have," she agreed, but without anger. "What do we do now?" Blake considered. "We can't go back to the cabin, not with them waiting there." He looked west toward the mountains. "I have a line shack about 10 miles from here. We'll go there, wait them out." They rode side by side, pushing the horses as much as they dared on the increasingly rough terrain. Blake explained more as they traveled. "The man I killed was Emmett Dobbs. He was a small-time criminal, robbery, extortion, that sort of thing. His brother Franklin runs the operation now. He's been after me for 2 years." "Why haven't you gone to the law?" Katherine asked. Blake gave her a wry look. "Law's thin out here, and Franklin Dobbs has money enough to buy influence when he needs it." "So you've been hiding all this time?" "Not hiding, just keeping my distance." Blake's expression softened slightly. "Until I found you in Silver Creek." Katherine felt a flutter in her chest at his words, but pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for such feelings. They reached the line shack as the sun was setting. It was little more than a one-room structure with a small stove, a table, and a cot, but it offered shelter from the approaching night. Blake unsaddled the horses and hobbled them nearby while Katherine assessed their supplies, which consisted of little more than what Blake had in his saddlebags and the gun in Katherine's apron pocket. "You brought my spare revolver," Blake noted when she showed it to him. "I thought I might need it," she said, "though I don't actually know how to use it properly." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Brave and resourceful. You continue to surprise me, Katherine Anderson." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "What's our plan?" Blake built a small fire in the stove. "We'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll circle back toward the cabin, see if Dobbs and his men are still there. If they're gone, we can return. If not," he shrugged, "we'll figure something out." They shared the jerky and hardtack from Blake's saddlebags, washing it down with water from a nearby spring. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. "You take the cot," Blake said, just as he had that first night at the cabin. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," Katherine argued. "And it's too cold to sleep on the floor." Blake looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "What are you suggesting?" Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "The cot's narrow, but we could share it. For warmth," she added hastily. After a moment's hesitation, Blake nodded. "All right, for warmth." They lay side by side on the narrow cot, a blanket from Blake's saddlebags covering them both. Despite the innocent reason for their closeness, Katherine was acutely aware of the heat of his body beside hers, the rhythm of his breathing, the scent of pine and leather that she'd come to associate with him. "Blake," she whispered into the darkness. Thank you. For saving me in Silver Creek, for everything since." He was silent for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then his hand found hers beneath the blanket, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I should be thanking you," he said softly. "It's been a long time since I had someone to care about, someone who cared about me." Katherine's heart pounded. She turned her head to find him watching her, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight coming through the cabin's single window. "I do care about you," she admitted. Blake's free hand came up to touch her cheek. "Katherine," he murmured, and there was a world of feeling in the way he said her name. Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant, a question asked and answered in the dark quiet of the lined shack. When they pulled apart, Katherine felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them. "We should sleep," Blake said, though he made no move to release her hand or put distance between them. "Yes," she agreed, but found herself leaning in to kiss him again instead. This kiss was deeper, more certain. Blake's arm slid around her waist, drawing her closer. Katherine felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the blanket covering them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing a little faster, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "We should definitely sleep," he said, a note of reluctance in his voice. Katherine smiled in the darkness. "Definitely." She turned in his arms, her back to his chest, and felt him settle behind her, one arm draped protectively over her waist. Despite the danger they faced, despite the uncertainty of their future, Katherine felt a profound sense of rightness as she drifted toward sleep in Blake's embrace. Morning came with a light dusting of snow on the ground outside the lined shack. Katherine woke to find herself alone on the cot, though the blanket had been tucked carefully around her. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and saw Blake by the stove, heating coffee in a small pot. "Morning," he said, looking over at her. "Sleep well?" "Yes," she replied, wondering if the intimacy of the night before would be acknowledged in the light of day. "You," a small smile touched his lips, "better than I have in years." Katherine felt a pleasant warmth spread through her at his words. She rose and joined him by the stove, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. "What's the plan for today?" she asked after taking a sip. "We head back," Blake said, his expression turning serious. "Carefully. If Dobbs and his men are still at the cabin, we'll need to figure out a more permanent solution. And if they're gone, then we prepare. They know where I live now, they'll be back." He met her eyes. "You should know once we deal with this situation. I won't hold you to anything said or done last night. You're still free to go to Boston if that's what you want." Katherine studied his face, seeing the careful neutrality he was trying to maintain. And if that's not what I want? Something flickered in Blake's eyes. Hope, perhaps. Then we'll figure that out too. They set out after a simple breakfast, riding cautiously through terrain that had been transformed by the light snowfall. The world seemed hushed, wrapped in white, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft ground. Blake led them on a circuitous route back toward the cabin, keeping to the cover of trees when possible. By mid-morning, they'd reached a ridge overlooking the property. "Wait here," Blake said, dismounting. "I'll go ahead on foot, see what we're dealing with." Katherine nodded, though she didn't like the idea of him going alone. "Be careful." He squeezed her hand briefly, then moved off through the trees, his revolver drawn. Katherine waited anxiously, one hand on Penny's neck to keep the mare quiet, the other on Blake's spare gun in her pocket. 20 minutes later, Blake returned, his expression grim. "They're still there, all three of them. Looks like they've made themselves at home." "What do we do?" Blake considered. "We need help. There's a ranch about 15 miles east of here, belongs to a man named Daniel Cooper. He's a friend. He'll help us." They rode east, pushing harder now that they had a clear destination. Katherine's mind raced with possibilities, none of them pleasant. Would they have to abandon the cabin, move elsewhere? And what would that mean for whatever was growing between her and Blake? The Cooper Ranch came into view around noon, a substantial spread with a large main house, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals. Blake and Katherine approached openly, and they were met in the yard by a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked dark hair. "Blake Sutton," the man said, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Been a while." His eyes moved to Katherine. "And who's this?" "Daniel Cooper, meet Katherine Anderson," Blake said, helping Katherine dismount. "Katherine, this is Daniel, the best horse breeder in Wyoming and a good friend." "Madam," Daniel said, tipping his hat, "any friend of Blake's is welcome here." "Thank you," Katherine replied. "I'm afraid we're in some trouble and could use your help." Daniel's expression turned serious. "Dobbs," Blake nodded. "3 of them at my cabin, Harley, Joe, and one other." Daniel spat into the dirt. Been a long time coming, this confrontation. He looked between them. "Come inside. Emily will fix you some food while we talk." Emily Cooper proved to be a warm, maternal woman who fussed over Katherine's bruises now fading to yellow, and insisted she eat seconds of the hearty stew she served. While they ate, Blake explained the situation to Daniel, including the events in Silver Creek that had brought Katherine into his life. "So you need to deal with these men once and for all," Daniel said when Blake had finished. "Can't keep running, not if you want any kind of life." His eyes flickered meaningfully between Blake and Katherine. "I know," Blake agreed, "but I want to do it legally if possible. I don't need more blood on my hands." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "The new territorial marshal passed through here last week, man named Colton. Straight shooter from what I could tell. He's probably in Laramie now." "That's a day's ride," Blake said. "I can send one of my hands," Daniel offered. "Meanwhile, you two rest up. Tomorrow we'll pay a visit to your unwelcome guests." Katherine expected Blake to protest, to insist on handling the situation himself. Instead, he nodded. "Thank you, Daniel." Emily showed them to a guest room singular, Katherine noticed with both embarrassment and a flutter of anticipation. When Emily had gone, Katherine turned to Blake. "You trust Daniel completely with my life," Blake said simply. "He gave me my start in horse breeding when I first came to Wyoming, taught me everything I know." Katherine sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 2 days. What if the marshal won't help? What if Dobbs comes after us again? Blake sat beside her, taking her hand. "One problem at a time." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "Are you all right? This isn't what you signed up for when you let me lead you away from Silver Creek." Katherine gave a shaky laugh. "I didn't exactly sign up for anything. I was just grateful to escape." She looked at him, her expression softening. "But I'm not sorry, not about any of it." Blake's eyes darkened. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. Katherine met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that quickly deepened. His arms went around her, drawing her close, and she melted against him, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that properly since this morning," he murmured. "Just since this morning," Katherine teased. Blake smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. "No. Since the moment you looked up at me with those honey-brown eyes in Silver Creek, brave despite everything they'd done to you." The raw honesty in his voice made Katherine's heart swell. She kissed him again, pouring all her unspoken feelings into the contact. Blake responded with equal fervor, his hand spanning her waist, lifting her to sit more fully on the bed. A knock at the door broke them apart. Blake cleared his throat. "Yes, supper in an hour," came Emily's voice. "And Blake, Daniel wants a word in his study when you're ready." "I'll be right there," Blake called back. He looked at Katherine, his eyes still dark with desire. "To be continued," he said softly. After he'd gone, Katherine took a moment to collect herself. Her body hummed with a new awareness, a yearning she'd never experienced so intensely before. She moved to the window, looking out at the Cooper Ranch bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. For the first time since her father's death, she felt hope for the future, a future that, increasingly, she could only imagine with Blake by her side. But first, they had to resolve the threat hanging over them. Supper was a pleasant affair, with Daniel and Emily's 3 children joining them at the table. The oldest, a boy of about 16, peppered Blake with questions about horse breeding, while the 2 younger girls were fascinated by Katherine's Eastern origins. "Pennsylvania must be so civilized," sighed the elder girl, who was perhaps 13. "With proper shops and dances and everything." Katherine smiled. "Parts of it are, but I grew up on a farm not much different from a ranch here except smaller and with more trees." "Do you miss it?" asked the younger girl. Katherine considered the question. "I miss certain things. The changing of the seasons, autumn is particularly beautiful there, and I miss people I knew. But," she glanced at Blake across the table, "I'm finding there's much to appreciate about Wyoming as well." After supper, while Daniel and Blake conferred in the study, Emily showed Katherine to a bath that had been prepared in a small room off the kitchen. The hot water was heavenly after 2 days of hard riding, and Katherine lingered until it began to cool. Clean and dressed in a nightgown borrowed from Emily, Katherine returned to the guest room to find Blake already there, freshly bathed himself and wearing only trousers and an unbuttoned shirt. The sight of his bare chest, tanned and muscled from years of physical labor, made her breath catch. "Daniel sent his fastest rider to Laramie," Blake said, seemingly unaware of her reaction. "With luck, the marshal will be here by tomorrow evening." "And tomorrow?" Katherine asked, moving further into the room. "Tomorrow we go to the cabin. Daniel, 3 of his hands, you and me." Blake sat on the edge of the bed to remove his boots. "We'll try to resolve this peacefully. If Dobbs's men won't back down, we'll hold them until the marshal arrives." Katherine nodded, though the prospect of confrontation frightened her. "Will there be shooting?" Blake looked up at her, his expression serious. "I hope not, but it's possible." He patted the bed beside him. "Come here." Katherine sat next to him and he took her hands in his. "You don't have to come tomorrow. You can stay here with Emily and the children." "No," Katherine said firmly. "I'm coming with you. It's my home too now." The words slipped out before she could consider them. Blake's eyes widened slightly, then softened with an emotion that made her heart race. "Is it?" he asked quietly. "Your home," Katherine met his gaze steadily, "if you want it to be." Blake's hand came up to cup her cheek. "I want that more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." Their kiss this time was different, still passionate, but with a tenderness that spoke of deeper feelings than mere desire. Blake's arms encircled her, drawing her against him, and Katherine went willingly, her hands exploring the warm skin of his chest and back. When his lips left hers to trail down her neck, Katherine gasped, her head falling back to give him better access. "Blake," she whispered, her voice uneven. He pulled back slightly to look at her, his eyes asking a question. In answer, Katherine reached for the ties of her borrowed nightgown. "Are you sure?" Blake asked, his voice husky. "I'm sure," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice or her heart. Their lovemaking was both gentle and intense, a discovery of each other that left them breathless and amazed. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilt, Katherine's head on Blake's chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I never expected this," Blake murmured into her hair. "When I saw you in Silver Creek, I just wanted to help. I never imagined that we'd end up here," Katherine finished for him, raising her head to look at him. "Neither did I, but I'm glad we did." Blake's smile was tender. "So am I." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Katherine, know that I love you." The words, so simply spoken, filled Katherine with joy. "I love you too, Blake." They fell asleep in each other's arms, the worries of tomorrow temporarily forgotten in the warmth of their newfound love. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of resolve. Katherine dressed in clothes borrowed from Emily, practical riding clothes that would allow her freedom of movement if things went poorly at the cabin. Blake was similarly prepared, with extra ammunition for his revolver and a rifle borrowed from Daniel's collection. They rode out after breakfast. Blake, Katherine, Daniel, and 3 of Daniel's most trusted ranch hands. All were armed, though Blake had made it clear that they hoped to resolve the situation without bloodshed. "Franklin Dobbs is the real problem," Blake explained as they rode. "He's the one who won't let go of the past. His brother Harley and the others are just following orders. Men like that understand only one thing: force," Daniel said grimly. "But we'll try it your way first, Blake." They approached the cabin cautiously, using the cover of trees to shield their approach. When they were within sight, Blake signaled for them to stop. 3 horses still there, he observed. "Looks like all of them stayed." "What's the plan?" asked one of Daniel's men, a weathered cowboy named Tom. "Daniel and I will approach openly," Blake said. "The rest of you stay hidden, rifles ready. If things go south, you'll hear it. Katherine, you stay with Tom." Katherine wanted to protest but knew he was right. She was no gunfighter. "Be careful," she said, touching Blake's arm. He covered her hand with his. "Always." Blake and Daniel rode slowly toward the cabin, their hands visible and away from their weapons. Katherine watched anxiously from the tree line, her heart in her throat. The cabin door opened and Harley Dobbs stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The 2 other men appeared at the windows, guns visible. "That's far enough, Sutton," Harley called. "You've got nerve coming back here." "This is my home, Dobbs," Blake replied evenly. "You're trespassing." "Your home," Harley laughed. "Not for much longer. Franklin's on his way. He'll be here by sundown." Katherine felt a chill at his words. If Franklin Dobbs was coming, their time was running out. "It doesn't have to be this way," Blake said. "What happened in Denver was fair. Your brother drew first in front of witnesses. The law cleared me." "The law," Harley spat. "Franklin makes his own law." "And how's that working out for you?" Daniel interjected. "Living like outlaws, carrying out a vendetta that won't bring your brother back." Harley's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you, Daniel Cooper? This land borders mine. Blake is my friend." Daniel's voice hardened. "And I don't take kindly to people threatening my friends." A tense silence followed. Katherine could see Harley considering his options, looking from Blake to Daniel and back. "The territorial marshal is on his way," Blake added. "He'll be here by evening. Whatever you think of the local law, he represents federal authority. Do you really want to add resisting a federal officer to your troubles?" This seemed to give Harley pause. He conferred briefly with his companions, their voices too low for Katherine to hear. "Prove it," Harley said finally. "Prove the marshal's coming." "I can't do that," Blake replied, "but I give you my word. And I'll add this: if you leave now peacefully, I won't press charges for the trespassing or the threats to Miss Anderson." Another conference among the three men. Then, surprisingly, Harley lowered his rifle. "Fine," he said. "We'll go. But this isn't over, Sutton. Franklin won't let it be that easy." "That's between me and Franklin," Blake said steadily. "Just leave the woman out of it." Harley's eyes narrowed. "She means something to you, doesn't she? The woman from town." A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Interesting." Blake's expression didn't change, but Katherine saw his shoulders tense. "Your horses are behind the corral. Take them and go." For a tense moment, Katherine thought Harley might refuse. Then he nodded to his companions. "Get the horses. We're leaving." The three men collected their belongings and their horses under the watchful eyes of Blake and Daniel. As they mounted up, Harley looked directly at Blake. "Franklin will hear about this. And about her." His gaze moved to the tree line as if he could see Katherine hiding there. "He'll be very interested." Then they rode off, heading east at a steady pace. Blake and Daniel waited until they were out of sight before signaling to the others that it was safe to approach. Katherine rode Penny to Blake's side. "That seemed too easy," she said quietly. Blake nodded, his expression troubled. "It was. Harley's not one to back down without a fight. Something's not right." "You think he was telling the truth about Franklin coming?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Blake said grimly, "and that's what worries me. Harley might have decided to wait for his brother rather than risk facing us alone." They approached the cabin cautiously, but found nothing amiss inside except for some empty whiskey bottles and dirty dishes. Blake's possessions appeared untouched. "We should prepare," Blake said, checking his rifle. "If Franklin is really coming, we need to be ready." They spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon fortifying the cabin as best they could. Daniel sent one of his men back to the ranch for additional supplies and ammunition, while the others helped Blake move furniture to create defensive positions. Katherine cleaned the cabin, removing all traces of the intruders and preparing food for what might be a long wait. As she worked, she couldn't help but worry about what would happen when Franklin Dobbs arrived. From everything Blake had said, the man was dangerous and obsessed with revenge. Mid-afternoon brought another rider, not Franklin Dobbs, but a young man in a deputy's uniform. He introduced himself as Deputy Warren, sent ahead by Marshal Colton, who was following with a small posse. "Marshal got your message this morning," Deputy Warren explained. "We rode out immediately. He sent me ahead to let you know he's coming and to assess the situation." Blake explained what had happened with Harley and his men, and the threat of Franklin's imminent arrival. "Franklin Dobbs," the deputy said thoughtfully. "The marshal will be interested to hear that name. There's a federal warrant out for Dobbs for interfering with the mail and robbing a stage line in Idaho territory." This was news to Blake. "I knew he was involved in some shady business, but nothing that serious." "It's recent," Deputy Warren said. "Within the last 6 months. The marshal's been tracking him." This changed the situation considerably. If Franklin Dobbs was already wanted by federal authorities, their position was stronger than they'd realized. "How far behind you is the marshal?" Daniel asked. 2, maybe 3 hours, the deputy replied. He's bringing 4 men with him. Blake nodded, relief evident in his face. Then we hold tight until he arrives. As the afternoon waned, they positioned lookouts around the property. Katherine found herself alone with Blake in the cabin for a few minutes while the others were outside. "Are you all right?" he asked, moving to stand beside her at the window. "Yes," she said, though her hands trembled slightly, "just anxious for this to be over." Blake's arm slipped around her waist. "It will be, one way or another." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And then we can start thinking about the future." Katherine leaned into him. "What kind of future do you imagine?" A small smile touched his lips. "One with you in it. Beyond that, the details are negotiable." Their moment of peace was interrupted by a shout from outside. "Riders approaching." At least 6 of them. Blake tensed, his arm tightening around Katherine before he released her. "Stay inside," he said, reaching for his rifle. "Away from the windows." Katherine nodded, her heart pounding as Blake moved to the door. Through the window, she could see a group of horsemen approaching from the east, 5 rough-looking men, led by a 6th whose bearing marked him as their leader. Franklin Dobbs, she presumed. Blake, Daniel, Deputy Warren, and Daniel's men took up defensive positions around the cabin. Katherine watched anxiously from just inside the door, the spare revolver clutched in her hand. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. The leader, a tall man with dark hair streaked with gray, and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his eyes, surveyed the scene. "Blake Sutton," he called. "I believe you've been expecting me." Blake stepped forward, rifle ready but not aimed directly at the man. "Franklin Dobbs. Yes, your brother mentioned you were coming. Then you know why I'm here." Franklin's voice carried easily across the distance. "Justice for my brother Emmett." "The law already delivered justice," Blake replied. "Your brother drew on me. I defended myself. Any court in the territory would say the same." Franklin's face hardened. "I'm not interested in what the courts say. I make my own justice." His eyes moved to the deputy's uniform. "I see you've brought the law into this. That was a mistake." "There's a federal warrant for your arrest, Dobbs," Deputy Warren called. "Marshal Colton is on his way with a posse. He'll be here within the hour." This news seemed to give Franklin pause. He conferred briefly with his men, then turned back to Blake. "1 hour won't make a difference. You killed my brother, Sutton, an eye for an eye." He nodded to his men. "Spread out, we'll take the cabin." Blake fired a warning shot into the air. "The next one won't be a warning, Dobbs. There are 6 of us, all armed. You won't take the cabin without losing men." "Maybe not," Franklin conceded, "but I hear you've got something to lose too." His cold gaze moved to the cabin door where Katherine stood partially visible. "A woman worth fighting for, Harley tells me." Blake's expression darkened. "Leave her out of this. She has nothing to do with what happened in Denver." "She does now," Franklin said with a cruel smile. "You care for her, that makes her part of this." He turned to his men. "Take positions. When I give the signal, we move in." The tension was palpable as Franklin's men spread out, seeking cover behind rocks and trees. Blake and the others did the same, creating a defensive perimeter around the cabin. Katherine's mind raced. The marshal was coming, but would he arrive in time? And even if he did, would Franklin Dobbs surrender peacefully? Or would there be bloodshed? The standoff lasted perhaps 15 minutes, though it felt like hours to Katherine. Then, suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats broke the tense silence. Many horses, approaching from the west. "The marshal," Deputy Warren said, relief evident in his voice. Sure enough, a group of riders appeared, led by a broad-shouldered man wearing a marshal's badge. They rode directly toward the cabin, seemingly unconcerned about the armed men surrounding it. "Franklin Dobbs." The marshal called as they approached. This is Marshal James Colton. You're surrounded and outnumbered. Throw down your weapons and surrender peacefully." Franklin's face contorted with rage. For a moment, Katherine thought he might order his men to open fire. Then, surprisingly, he raised his hands. "Another day, perhaps," he said, his eyes finding Blake. "This isn't over, Sutton." "It is for today," Marshal Colton said firmly, dismounting. "Franklin Dobbs, you're under arrest for mail robbery, stagecoach robbery, and threatening a federal officer." He nodded to his deputies. "Disarm them all." The next hour passed in a blur as Franklin and his men were disarmed, handcuffed, and loaded onto horses for the journey to Laramie. Marshal Colton took statements from Blake, Katherine, and the others about the events of the past few days. "You'll need to come to Laramie to testify," the marshal told Blake. "But that can wait until next week. For now, I think the immediate danger is past." As the marshal prepared to leave with his prisoners, Katherine overheard him speaking quietly to Blake. "Franklin Dobbs will likely hang for the stage robbery," he said. "2 men died in that holdup. His days of seeking personal vengeance are over." Blake nodded, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. "Thank you, Marshal, for everything." "Just doing my job," Marshal Colton replied. "Take care of that young lady of yours. She seems like a keeper." After the marshal and his prisoners had departed, and Daniel and his men had returned to their ranch with promises to check in the next day, Blake and Katherine found themselves alone in the cabin for the first time in days. "It's over," Katherine said, still hardly believing it. "Really over." Blake nodded, pulling her into his arms. "Franklin Dobbs won't trouble us again. Even if he somehow avoids hanging, he'll spend years in a federal prison." Katherine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What happens now?" Blake's hand came up to stroke her hair. "Now, Katherine Anderson, we start living." He tilted her face up to his. "If that's still what you want." Katherine smiled, her heart full to bursting. "It's all I want." Their kiss was a promise, a beginning, a declaration of all they'd come to mean to each other in the short time since that fateful day in Silver Creek. Later, as they lay together in Blake's bed, their bed now, Katherine asked the question that had been on her mind. "Do you ever regret it, helping me that day in town?" Blake propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with tenderness in his eyes. "Not for a single moment. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Even with all the trouble it brought, even with that," he confirmed. "Some things are worth fighting for." His fingers traced the curve of her cheek. "Some people are worth fighting for." Katherine caught his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "I love you, Blake Sutton. And I love you, Katherine Anderson." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Soon to be Katherine Sutton, if I have any say in the matter." Katherine's heart soared at his words. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Sutton?" "It is indeed, Miss Anderson." Blake's expression turned solemn, though his eyes still smiled. "Will you marry me, Katherine? Make a life with me here?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." Their kiss sealed the promise, and as Katherine drifted toward sleep in Blake's arms, she marveled at the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. From the cruelty she'd faced in Silver Creek to the love she'd found with the quiet cowboy who'd covered her with his hat and led her away to a new life. The road hadn't been easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But together, she knew they could face whatever came their way. And that, Katherine thought as sleep claimed her, was worth everything. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Katherine stood in the bedroom of what was now truly her home, admiring her reflection in the small mirror. Her wedding dress was simple but beautiful cream-colored satin with lace trim that Emily Cooper had helped her sew. Her honey-brown hair was swept up, adorned with wildflowers freshly picked that morning. A knock at the door announced Emily's arrival. "Oh, Katherine," she said, her eyes shining. "You look absolutely beautiful. Blake won't know what hit him." Katherine smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I hope so. Is everything ready?" "As ready as it'll ever be," Emily assured her. "The minister's here, the food's prepared, and the guests are arriving." "And Blake is pacing like a caged mountain lion." Katherine laughed. In the months since the confrontation with Franklin Dobbs, life had settled into a pleasant rhythm. Blake had traveled to Laramie to testify at Dobbs's trial, returning with news that the man had indeed been sentenced to hang for his crimes. With that dark cloud lifted, they had focused on building their future together. Blake's horse breeding business had flourished, thanks in part to Katherine's head for figures and her talent for record-keeping. They had added a small room to the cabin and improved the garden, making the place truly their home. The wedding had been Katherine's idea, not because she needed the ceremony to validate their commitment, but because she wanted to celebrate their love with the community that had embraced them. Daniel and Emily Cooper, Marshall Colton, and even a few reformed citizens of Silver Creek had been invited to share in their joy. "It's time," Emily said gently. "Are you ready?" Katherine nodded, her heart full. "More than ready." They walked together from the cabin to the clearing by the stream, where wooden benches had been arranged in rows. About 30 people had gathered, all turning to watch as Katherine appeared. At the front, beside the minister, stood Blake, clean-shaven, wearing a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed. But it was his expression that took Katherine's breath away, the love and wonder in his eyes as he watched her approach. Daniel Cooper stood beside him as best man, while Emily's eldest daughter waited at the front to stand as Katherine's maid of honor. But Katherine barely noticed them. Her eyes were fixed on Blake, the man who had saved her in more ways than one. As she reached him, Blake took her hands in his. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "So are you," she replied with a smile. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with vows they had written themselves. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Blake kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "Mrs. Sutton," he murmured against her lips. "Mr. Sutton," she returned, her heart overflowing with happiness. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and more genuine goodwill than Katherine had experienced since leaving Pennsylvania. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the valley, Blake led her away from the festivities to a quiet spot by the stream. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Are you?" Blake's smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "More than I ever thought possible." He turned her to face him. "I have something for you, a wedding gift." From his pocket he withdrew a small velvet pouch. Opening it, he tipped a delicate gold locket into his palm. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice soft with memory. "The only thing of value she owned. She would have wanted you to have it." Katherine's eyes filled with tears as Blake fastened the locket around her neck. "It's beautiful, thank you." "Open it," he encouraged. Inside was a tiny photograph of the two of them, taken in Laramie the month before by a traveling photographer. On the opposite side was an inscription: "To my Katherine, who taught me to love again. Forever, Blake." "Oh, Blake," Katherine whispered, too moved for more words. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close as the setting sun painted the world in shades of gold and rose. "When I saw you that day in Silver Creek, I never imagined where it would lead," he said softly. "I just knew I couldn't ride away and leave you there." "I'm glad you didn't," Katherine replied, looking up at him with all the love in her heart shining in her eyes. "So am I." Blake's smile was tender as he bent to kiss her again. "So am I." As twilight deepened around them, they walked hand in hand back toward the celebration and the friends who had become their family. Ahead lay a lifetime together, a lifetime born from a moment of courage and compassion on a dusty street in a frontier town, when a cowboy covered a beaten woman with his hat and led her away to a future brighter than either of them could have imagined.